Alright, so today we want to pick up where we left off in Chapter 7. And last week, if you remember, I have a new clicker today, I gotta learn. I already messed up. Which button does what here? Okay. So last week, we left off in Chapter 7. We had just finished up the different types of agency relationships and a sales transaction. Does that sound familiar to everybody? We talked about the fact that there were 4 agency relationships from the firm's perspective, and then there. I gave you these already. Did I give out these cards last week?
No.
Your classmates said I didn't give them out last week. You got in a different class. Is it okay if I give them to everybody else? I'm so evil, aren't I? Oh, she looked terrified. That's part about my job. So we talked about the fact that there are 4 different types of agency relationships and sales transactions, because we're only talking about sales transactions at this point. We will talk about leases later. Remember, sales transactions are not the only kind of transactions. They're just the most prominent ones, the most important ones from an agency standpoint, because traditionally our role is to sell things more than it is to lease them. But when we talk about these agency relationships, we said they come in 4s. Everything happens in multiples of 4. I'm just giving one for every seat. If somebody comes in late, you got them. From the firm's perspective, what were the 4 possibilities for agency relationships from the firm's perspective, not the client's perspective? And those of you that have already put these cards in front of you, keep in mind that these may not be the 4 answers. They're probably pretty close. But from the firm's perspective, what are the 4 possibilities? Because there's no way you can possibly understand agency if you don't even know what the possibilities for agency are. And that's going to be really important to make sure you know what those possibilities are. So what are the 4 possibilities when it comes to agency from the firm's perspective? Just put it in case I should have. The silence is deafening here. What are the 4? Give me one of them. What kind of buyer agency? There's no such thing as buyer agency. Exclusive buyer agency. Why is that word exclusive important? Because the firm represents how many parties? One. In case of show. The firm only represents one party. That's what the word exclusive means. It also works from the standpoint of the buyer. How many firms has the buyer hired in exclusive buyer agency? Just one. That word exclusive is a really important word when you talk about agency relationships. So exclusive buyer agency, that's one of the relationships a firm could have with a client. What's another relationship a firm could have in a transaction? Exclusive seller agency, which is the exact opposite. The firm is on whose team, on whose side of that transaction? They are the listing side, right? They are on the seller's side. We said the seller's side is the listing side of the transaction, and they're on the seller's side. So, what else we have? I heard both of them, so that's good. I heard a cooperative transaction. What is a cooperative transaction? Both sides are represented, but you haven't gotten to the root of the thing. These are 2 different real estate firms. That's the thing that should, when you hear co-op, who's cooperating? It's not 2 brokers, it's 2 what? It's 2 firms. 2 firms, one cooperating with another. One firm representing the buyer, a completely different firm. And what do we say a firm was? A firm is not a name. What is a firm? So we have to get back to that definition too. We've got to start tying them all together. An entity, but that's not the most important part of the definition of a firm. What is the definition of a firm? Now, agency is part of it, but that's not the most important definition. See, this is about getting you to understand license law and rules at the same time. I have to hammer it in you. I said it 3 times last week because I went back and counted on the video because I wanted to make sure. A firm is a physical what? Location. A firm is a physical location. See, you have to know that because you cannot understand foreign dual agency unless you know if the firm represents both who? The buyer and the seller. Keller Williams Elite represents the buyer. Keller Williams Premier Properties represents the seller. Dual agency, yes or no?
No.
No, why not? 2 different what? What is the most important thing? Locations. 2 different physical locations. If you have a physical office location, that is a what? That is a firm in North Carolina, and therefore it needs who running it? A broker in charge. There's going to be separate firms, separate brokers in charge, therefore it's not dual agency. If you can't sort through that on a test, you'll never even get off the ground as far as agency question is. That's the level to which you have to dissect this stuff. If you're thinking about this stuff, oh yeah, I got that. No, you don't. I promise you don't. Because there are instructors who have been teaching this stuff for a decade, and every time they have a conversation with me about agency, you know what they come away saying? Holy shit, I never knew that. So I can assure you, you don't know it yet. No matter how much you know, and I hope you know a lot, you don't know it yet, because you could spend years focused on agency and not get it all. That's how deep this stuff goes. This stuff runs deep, super deep. So we covered 3. Exclusive buyer agency, exclusive seller agency. What was the one we just talked about? Cooperative, when there are 2 firms involved. And then what's the last possibility from a firm's perspective? Dual agency. And what is the single biggest factor of dual agency? How do you instantly recognize as dual agency? 1 firm, but how many clients? 2. Well, there's always 2 parties involved in a transaction. I use that word client very carefully, because what is a client? Somebody we what? We represent. Could we have a transaction where there's 1 firm, 1 client, 1 customer? What kind of representation or agency would that be? Exclusive buyer or seller, depending on who the firm represents. Does that make sense? Because the firm is going to have 1 client, and the other party is going to be their what? Their customer. That's the depth of the thing. Dual agency means you have 1 firm but 2 clients. Is everybody okay with that? And the firm sits in the middle. And that's the 4 possibilities from the firm's perspective. Designated dual agency is not anything from the firm's perspective. Because what is designated dual agency from the firm perspective? It's dual agency. Because the firm is representing who? Both. Designated dual agency doesn't exist from the firm's perspective. It exists from whose perspective? No, not the firm's perspective. Not even from the agent's perspective. The agent is the firm. The client's perspective. Designated dual agency is a client perspective thing. And you have to learn it that way. Because some of you will convince yourself that designated dual agency is not what? What's the last 2 words? Dual agency. First and foremost, designated dual is what? Dual. Because 1 firm represents both the buyer and the seller at the same time. So when you were asked from the firm's perspective, what is the firm in that transaction? What are they? Neutral. They're just what? If the firm represents the buyer and the seller, what is the firm's relationship in the transaction? Come on, wake up. The firm represents the buyer and the seller. It's the simplest definition. We've said it 56,000 times already this morning. What is it? Dual agency. See how hard you're making it? You're making it hard. It's not because I'm yelling at you. It's because you're making it hard. Because you're refusing to accept the fact that the firm can't be a designated dual agent. The firm can be a what? A dual agent. Because the firm can represent what? Both at the same time. And that's dual agency, and that's all it ever is. Designated dual agency is from whose perspective? The client's. That's a client viewpoint. Because the client has a different perspective than the firm does. Does that make sense to you guys?
I'm not clear there.
I'm sorry?
I'm not clear there.
About what?
Because
I don't understand why it's not from the designated dual agency, not from the firm perspective.
Who does the firm represent?
It represents both firms.
Stop it. I don't even say but. Don't keep going. Because she knows how she spit out. No. But what does she start with? What? And I'm not picking on Jocelyn because she said it. She's voicing what 30 of you in here are afraid to voice. What is the word she started with? It represents what? Both. Stop right there. That's dual agency. Period. End of discussion. That is dual agency from the firm. Because designated is not about representing both. Designated is about taking a what? A side. Picking a side. The firm can't what? Pick a side. Because the firm represents, what's our favorite word? Both. So from the firm's perspective, it is simply what? Dual agency. From the client's perspective, has someone chosen a side? Yes. Who is that someone? It is not the firm. The broker in charge hasn't even chosen a side. They might have chosen who's going to be on each side, but who has chosen a side? Who has picked a side and said, I'm going to help you and only you? The individual brokers that have been designated. And that's why designated dual agency really only exists from the client's side of things. You have to remember that because it's so ultra important to remember that the firm still represents what? Both. That means the firm cannot help one over who? The other. The firm can't. Can the individual brokers that have been designated do that? Yes, they can. And that's why it's a client perspective thing, not a firm perspective thing. Because remember we said, whoever we designate, they go on this side with the buyer or they go on that side with the seller. What does everybody else do? Not nothing. Guard the what? The wall. Guard the wall that we just built between those two sides. Because everybody else is still what? Dual. Everybody else is still dual. What's the broker in charge's position? They're dual, right? The office manager, they're dual. Because who do they represent ultimately? Both. Every other broker in the firm, who do they represent? Both. The only ones who've been designated and put on the team are the ones who have been designated. Does that make sense to you guys? That's what I mean about the depth of understanding of this stuff. You've got to dig into it deeper. Yes, ma'am, Britt.
No, I was just going to say the same thing. That's what helped me to remember or understand the difference between designated and just dual agency. Just going back to your example, like even with dual agency, you said, I think you used me and another student on the other side, that everybody else is just holding that wall between the two. Mm-hmm. Even with the designated dual agency, it's still that everybody else is holding that wall.
That's right. And think about dual agency. Dual agency is really always about holding the wall, isn't it? When we're in true dual agency, what is the one thing we're trying to protect and keep away from each client? Information, specifically confidential information, right? Because the firm, whenever the firm is in a position of being a dual agent, whenever an individual broker is in a position of being a dual agent, they're very likely to have information that would harm one side or both. Does that make sense? And so in dual agency, our biggest job becomes doing what with that information? Protect it. Guard it. At all costs. Do not let it leak out to the buyer or to the seller. Well, that role is still there even when we're in designated dual agency because essentially what we've done is taken Lynn and Jocelyn out of the firm, put Lynn on one side, put Jocelyn on the other, but the rest of us are still there with the firm. And the firm's role is still what? Dual agency. So the rest of us, our job is to make sure that no personal confidential information, that's what I mean when I say guard the wall, right? To make sure, I don't mean literally they're going to be attacking each other over a wall. I hope you don't recognize that's not going to happen, right? I mean guard the information. Are we getting there on that? Okay? These are in-depth ideas. And that's the 4 types of agency from the firm's perspective. What about from the client's perspective? It's not very different. We just talked about the only one that's really different from the client perspective. What is it? Designated dual agency. Notice what's missing here. By the way, those 4 cards I just handed out, that's from the client perspective. What's missing there of the 4 from the firm's perspective? Cooperative. Because here's the thing, from the client's perspective, does cooperative mean anything? No, because it's not them who's cooperating. Who is it that's cooperating? The The firm, the client's not cooperating with anybody. The client's job is to do what's in their own best interest all the time. Is that not true? The question for the client is not whether they are acting in their own best interest, it's who's acting in their best interest with them and who's acting against them. Are those important things for a buyer to know or a seller to know? Absolutely. So 4 choices for a client. Exclusive buyer agency. What do they know about the firm in the transaction when they're in exclusive buyer agency? If I'm the buyer, what do I know about this firm if we're in exclusive buyer agency? They work for me, they got my back, they're looking out for my best interest. Does that make sense to everybody? What can a buyer work with a firm and the firm be exclusive seller agents? If you're hesitating for even a second, slap yourself in the face and say, yes, of course they can. A buyer can work with a firm in any of these 4 possibilities. Can a buyer work with a firm and that firm be functioning as an exclusive agent of the seller? Yes. Yes, no question about it. When you go to an open house, what are they functioning as? Exclusive what? Seller agents. If you're the buyer, they're working what? Against you. That's what exclusive seller agency means if you're a buyer. If you're a buyer, exclusive seller agency means that the real estate firm you're working with is actually working what? Against you. See, that's the problem. You all want to make working with and working for the exact same thing. Here's how I know that that's the stupidest thing in the world. How many of you have a job? How many of you have co-workers that you work with? Do you walk around saying you work for that person? Matter of fact, if somebody walked up to you and said, oh, you work for Tiffany, they'd be like, hell no, I don't work for Tiffany. I work with Tiffany, but not for. You see where I'm going? Is there a difference between working with and working for? You better believe there is. A very real difference. So a buyer can certainly work with a firm and that firm be working for the seller. On your cards right there where it says exclusive seller agency, now here's the test. What other phrase do we use to refer to that as? It's 2 words. I said you were going to see it a lot. That's the listing side, good, but that's not what I'm referring to. I'll give you the first word, seller. What's the second word? Subagency. Seller, subagency. Seller, subagency. And you hate that word. Oh, you hate that phrase. You know why? Because I've seen it for 20 years, 10 years now. I've been using it for 20 years. 10 years now, see how much you hate that phrase. You know why? You know why? I don't. I wish you'd tell me because it's just the silliest thing in the world. Seller, subagency. Who is a subagent? A broker who works for what? A firm. Seller, subagency. Put the 2 together. Broker works for a firm that works for who? The seller. Holy crap. Earth-shattering, right? It ain't that hard. I promise it's not. Get out of your own way. Seller subagency is just a broker who works for the firm, and the firm works for who? The seller. They're the listing firm. So, one of the ways I could say this, and I probably would say it in the real world, if I was asked, if I'm a listing broker, and I'm holding an open house, and a buyer came to my open house, I am an exclusive what? Exclusive seller agency. If I'm the listing agent, I'm holding an open house, and a buyer comes to that house, what is my relationship to that buyer? Exclusive what? Exclusive seller agency. Except nobody in this industry uses that terminology. What would we say we were? I am a what? I might say listing agent, but that's not what I'm hunting for. What word did we just talk about? Y'all don't pick up hints very well. I would say I am a seller subagent. I'm a seller subagent, which just means I'm on what side of the transaction? The seller side. That's all it means. That's all. Technically speaking, can I say I'm a buyer subagent? In a different situation? Yes. If I represented who? Wait, so give me when I would be a buyer subagent. I'm an agent who works for the firm that represents who? The buyer. That's what buyer subagency would be, is it not? So So give me an example, real world example of that. When would I be in buyer sub-agency? I bring the buyer to what table? Give me more information, whoever said that. Talk to me about the rest of the transaction. Bringing a buyer to the table does not mean I represent them. Does a listing agent sometimes bring buyers to the table? Yes. We have an agreement with them. We have an agency relationship. So you've got to go deeper than saying, I just brought the buyer. Bringing the buyer is not enough. That doesn't mean you represent them. See, that's the disconnect for you folks. You automatically make assumptions that aren't there. You always assume until you are told differently that a real estate broker represents who? Who did I say we always represented in transactions? The seller, not or, the seller. Always in a real estate transaction, that is the root of this business. Every real estate broker you encounter, you should make the basic assumption they represent who?
The seller.
The seller, until you're told differently, and you better handle it that way on a test. On a test, you always assume that that broker represents who? Because it's the most natural assumption. What are we generally hired to do? Sell something for somebody. It is much less common for who to have representation in the transaction. Buyers. Folks, you may not believe that because you live here in Raleigh where a significant number of buyers do have representation. What if I told you that there were areas in the state where if you talked to them about exclusive buyer agency, they would say, what is that? Go to the coast sometime. Go to Elizabeth City. Go to the mountains. They don't know what buyer agency is. You know why? They don't offer it. They don't do it. So, do they deal with buyers? It's pretty dang hard to sell something without dealing with buyers, isn't it? How do they deal with those buyers? As an unrepresented person, as a customer. So what would that mean? Give it to me in an agency term. Unrepresented or customer, those all mean something, but what does that mean? What is their position in the transaction? That's not dual agency. That is seller sub-agency or exclusive seller agency. Does that make sense? If I am dealing with this buyer completely as an agent of the seller, that is seller sub-agency. Here's the thing, and Jocelyn said dual agency. Could they presumably do it as dual agency?
Yes, they could.
Well, why they say they shouldn't? Who made you the moral arbiter of what should and should not be done?
No one made me that.
Nobody did, right? So don't say what they should and shouldn't do. But I said something important. I said they don't practice buyer agency, folks. If you don't practice any form of buyer agency, you're not representing the buyer in any way. If the firm's not representing the buyer in any way, doesn't that eliminate dual agency as a possibility? Because what's the definition of dual agency? Representing both the buyer and the seller. So if we say to you they don't do buyer agency, that means they also don't do what? Dual agency.
Then who would represent the buyer that?
Nobody. Yeah. That's exactly right. Buyer beware. You own your own.
So why is that a practice in those areas?
Why is that a practice in those areas? Gosh, she's so cute, isn't she? Because they want the what? They want all the money. The last thing they want to do is what? Share. People don't like to share. We teach our kids that, but just like everything else in the world, we teach our kids to do not what we do, right? Do as I say, not as I... How many people do you really know that live the life they tell their kids to live? The world would be a wonderful place if we all did that, wouldn't it? I mean, there are people who do that, but very few of us. Most of us drop an F-bomb when our kids say, don't say ugly words. My dad was a drill instructor. He never said that. He just dropped the F-bomb and moved on. You know, it was like, it was colorful language in our house, right? But that's what I mean. Like, we all have these lofty aspirations, but in the truth of it, why do they not do buyer agency? Because they don't want to, because what? They don't want to share. And if the buyer's unrepresented, who keeps all the commission? The listing firm. Yes, ma'am, Brittany.
Well, that generally means that they won't referral. They won't use a referral.
Who would they be referring to?
That's what I'm saying. So I'm assuming that's why they won't be using a referral, because on an example that you before, you're saying that, hey, I think you said on your video that you had a friend that said, hey, I got this buyer, but I think that they would like your house better, but you want like 50% of the commission. So that, they won't use a referral then, right?
They might not. They might not. You know, they may look at the transaction in a very antiquated way, what to us is antiquated in this area, and say buyers should be what? Unrepresented, on their own. Buyer beware. That's not the norm in this marketplace. Would y'all agree with that? You have to remember it's a big state. 11 million people. Agency is going to be practiced differently every single place. And for those of you who might be from a different part of the state, you'll have a different experience in what you see as a market. What I can tell you is buyer agency is by far the more common way to see a transaction play out, or a cooperative transaction, in the urban areas of the state. In the rural areas of the state, you're much more likely to see seller sub-agency or dual agency. Number one, smaller areas likely to have fewer what? Fewer firms and brokers, right? So it just leads to that a lot. And more rural area, more likely to have buyers that simply don't know that they can have what? Representation. They simply don't know, because it's the same way everybody else they know has bought real estate all those years.
So would they go like to open houses with these buyers, just find out where the open houses were, just will show up on their own and then say, I'm interested in this house, maybe they've done financing on their own and know what they can qualify for, and that's the way they get it.
If they're super well-educated buyers, that's exactly how it works. What Jonathan said is, oh, okay, so they just take it upon themselves to get qualified for a loan, and they know exactly what they can afford, and they, you know, and they do all that work. Yeah, if they're a really smart buyer, most of them just wander in with no preparation whatsoever. Is the listing broker going to help them with all that preparation? Yes, because they're not working in their best interest by getting them pre-qualified. What are they trying to do? They're trying to sell the house. Of course a listing broker is going to help them get qualified. Of course they are. They're still a listing broker. They're still a seller sub-agent. They're still an exclusive seller representative. Is everybody following me on that? Doesn't change their position in the transaction. See, agency is such a deep subject. It really is. And I hope, I'm really not trying to fire at you and challenge you, but I am trying to wake your brain up to get you to look at this from a deeper perspective. So let's go again. The 4 possibilities from the client's perspective. What are they? Let's talk about we'll talk about from a buyer's perspective first. In fact, let's rank them. How do we do that? Let's rank them from best or first to worst from the buyer's perspective of those 4 choices. Everybody ready to go? So what would be the buyer's best outcome in a transaction of those 4 agency choices? Exclusive what? Buyer agency. That should be a relatively obvious choice at this point. And if it's not, then you are making this harder than it needs to be. Because an exclusive buyer agency, whose team is the one firm that's involved in the transaction on? Whose team are they on? They're on the buyer's team. And that's the best possible outcome for that buyer. Does that make sense for everybody? Go to the other end of the spectrum. What's the worst possible outcome for the buyer from an agency perspective? Exclusive seller agency. Because there is a real estate firm involved in the transaction, but rather than working for the buyer, they are working what? Against the buyer. Do you see how that would be the worst possible outcome for a buyer in a transaction? Is everybody with me on that? So the opposite end of the spectrum. You got exclusive buyer agency is the best outcome for a buyer. And exclusive what? Seller agency. Another way to think of that, if I'm talking to my exclusive buyer agent, can I tell them anything? Can I bare my soul to them?
Yes.
Sure, because they have to do what with that information? Keep it confidential always. There is never any conceivable time that information could be used against me as long as they remain my exclusive buyer's agent. Does that make sense for everybody? So they can feel comfortable telling us anything, like attorneys in that regard. Would they need to be careful talking to an exclusive seller agent if they're the buyer?
Yes.
Yes, because any information they give to that person, what? Is going to be used against them in the transaction, automatically, because it has to be. Does that make sense to everybody? That right there should illustrate dramatically why one is the best situation and one is the worst. The other 2 sit in the middle, and the other 2 are both what kind of agency? They're both dual agency. We've got true dual agency, and then we've got designated dual agency. Of those two, which one is better for the buyer? Designated or true dual?
Designated.
Designated. Okay, good. I like the forcefulness of that answer. Why is designated better from the buyer's perspective than true dual would be?
They have control of.
They have representation. There's an A word I'm looking for. Advice. They get advice. They may only get advice from that one broker rather than a whole firm full of them. But truthfully, how many brokers were they expecting to get advice from anyway? Probably just that one. Does that make sense for everybody? So then what would be next down the line for the buyer then? True dual agencies. Let's put them in order again. Best over first would be what? Exclusive buyer. Then what? Designated dual. Then dual agency. Because the thing with dual agency, I don't have anybody working for me, but I also don't have anybody working against me. Does that make sense? Everybody's just neutral. And then the worst would be what? Exclusive seller agency. Watch this. Flip it around. Seller's perspective. What's the best possibility? Exclusive seller agency for obvious reasons, right? And then what's next? Designated dual, and then dual, and then the worst from the seller's perspective is exclusive buyer agency. You're feeling more confident about those. Good, good. You need to be able to turn them around in your head. You got a question, Mike?
Yeah, I'm just struggling to kind of, and I'm sure we're probably going to get there when we do it, but so somebody representing a buyer.
Okay.
Their job is essentially to whittle away their commission percentage.
Mm-hmm.
Neat. It's like, it's just.
Here's the thing. You're looking at it with a cynic's viewpoint. And here's what I mean by that. If I'm making 2.4% on a transaction, that's $24 for every $1,000 they pay for that house. 24 bucks. Am I really going to not do the best job possible for my client to make myself an extra $24 in commission? Because what you're hinting at is that my job as a buyer's agent is to get the price what? Lower, which inevitably lowers my commission. Well, let me put it out to you this way. Here's where I get harsh. If you're the kind of person who would sacrifice the best interest of your clients to make yourself an extra 50 bucks, leave now. Because I don't think there's any of those people in here. I have never once in my career thought, God, I'm not going to try to negotiate this price down because I'm going to make myself an extra. Because even if we're talking a $10,000 gap, that's $240, and that's before I even split it with my firm. It's just not an issue. It's just not an issue. I mean, I get, you're right to bring it up. It's a great question, and you're right to bring it up as a concern. But what I'm saying to you is, buyer's agents, at least those that I've encountered in my career, and that's thousands of them, it has never once entered into the conversation to think, I'm not going to push so hard to push that price down. You know? Because the realistic answer is that no transaction are you going to be negotiating off $200,000. Yeah, if we were dealing in numbers where, you know, we were making thousands of dollars worth of difference in commissions by negotiating a price down, people might find themselves in that kind of conflict of interest. But generally speaking, the negotiating we're doing is so far around the edges that
it's worth it to be good at your job.
That's exactly right. And to have your client feel like you were really busting your hump to get them the best possible deal, so hopefully they'll refer you more business. Yeah. And everybody understand the concern he's addressing there? That inherently, if a buyer's agent is paid some percentage of the sales price, they actually have this sort of reverse incentive to not want to negotiate the sales price down because it does lower their commission. But it lowers it by such small amounts, you know, we're sort of a drop in the bucket, that I've just never found it to be an issue in a transaction. All right? So, yes?
Real quick, if you go back to that buyer's agency in parts of the state,
Mm-hmm.
that's not a rule, is it?
No, absolutely not.
If I brought a buyer's agent to the middle of nowhere and bought a house, they can't stop me.
They cannot stop you, but that's not the question you're really asking, though. See, this is one of those things where you ask a question, and you don't even know that you're not asking the real question. There's the real question. Her question was the real one. Did everybody hear what she said? She said, is she going to get what? Paid for it. See, that's the part that they control. When I say they don't participate in buyer agency, you know why there are no buyer agents in that part of the state? Because none of the firms offer what? None of them offer to split their compensation. None of them say, bring us a buyer and we will do what? And we'll pay you. So the question, your first question I'm going to answer, can I bring a buyer's agent no matter where I am in the state? And the answer is absolutely yes. But if I am a buyer purchasing in a part of the state where firms do not cooperate with buyer's agents and don't compensate buyer's agents, what should I probably know going into that transaction if I want to hire a buyer agent? If they're not going to get paid by the other side, who's going to have to pay them? Me, out of my pocket. I'm going to have to write a check as the buyer to pay my own firm. And so that's going to be the real rub of bringing a buyer representative into one of those markets. Are they going to value your representation enough to both buy the property and then cut your firm a separate check for the buyer representation?
It's the firm's decision.
It's the listing firm's commission. Remember, the commission belongs to the listing firm.
So there's no regulation in the states of anything, it's just all of it.
Absolutely not, and nor could there be. That's going to be one of the things we talk about in Chapter 8 is, his question was there's no regulation in the state. The one thing the North Carolina Real Estate Commission will never regulate is that last word, commission. They will never touch it. They will never say you can't charge this or you have to charge that or you have to pay this person this. Because you go to jail for that. It's a felony. It's called price fixing. It's actually a violation of federal law. They can't regulate that. And so this is a competitive marketplace thing. That ultimately it's going to be up to the listing firm, and not just the listing firm. Who else signs the listing agreement? What other party signs that listing agreement? The client, the seller. Isn't the seller going to have some say over whether or not that firm splits that commission? You better believe they are. It's in the listing agreement. So, if I were listing a house for sale in the mountains, and I'm from this area, what would I probably insist on in my listing agreement? That they were willing to do what? They were willing to split the commission, and if a firm said, we don't do that, I would say, then we don't hire you. Because as a consumer, do I have the right to make that choice? And ultimately, that's what it'll take to change. It'll change. It'll change eventually. It changes more slowly in places like that, but it'll change eventually because you'll eventually have enough consumers that'll go in, and when they start selling their property, they'll be like, now wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Because when I've sold my house, do a lot of people that own houses on the coast or in the mountains also own houses in the Triangle and Charlotte and Greensboro and Wilmington in the metro areas where buyer agency is very prevalent. And are they very aware of the fact, and if those of you that have sold houses in this area, are you very aware of the fact that you're paying one number, but at least some major chunk of that is going to a firm to bring a buyer to the transaction, right? So if you were signing a listing agreement and you're like, well, how much are you paying to the buyer side? And they said 0, you'd immediately want them to do what? Change that number. Either pay the buyer side or discount your side, because I'm not paying you 5 or 6 or 7% to not pay the buyer side. See, that would be my perspective on it because I'm conditioned to this market. And so there is no control over it per se. It becomes like a market type driven thing. And it's a competitive thing. Okay? So that's why when you go buy, and even when you agree to represent people in other areas of the state where you're not familiar, you need to understand what you're getting into because you may be having to have a tough conversation with your buyer about them compensating your firm rather than your firm being compensated by the other side, because you should never make the assumption that the other side is willing to do what? Is willing to cooperate or split it with you. That's a poor assumption to make. They don't have to. They do not have to. Everybody okay? All right? So those are the types of relationships and sales transactions. Now that we've gone through that whole list, oh, sorry, Lee, go ahead.
Who assigns, back.
Yeah.
Who assigns the designated dual agency? This is assigned by
The broker in charge.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't have, the rule does not say it has, the question is who assigns the designated dual agent. The rule does not say it has to be the broker in charge, but from a practical standpoint, I've never seen it done by anybody other than the broker in charge. And if you think about it, the broker in charge makes the most logical sense of who would do the assignment. About the only time I can think of where the broker in charge might not do that assignment is where the broker in charge is going to be one of the designated dual agents themselves. Because remember, a broker in charge can be a designated dual agent as long as the other broker is what? not a what? Not a provisional broker, as long as the other one's a non-provisional. So maybe in that situation, you might allow somebody else in the firm to do the designating. Rather than saying, I'm going to designate myself, you might just get, your office manager who's also licensed to say, okay, Travis is going to be designated to do the seller and Lee's going to be designated to do the buyer. But most of the time, it's going to be the broker in charge. And that's also one of those reasons why if you go to a firm that practices designated dual agency, one of the first questions you ask ought to be to the broker in charge, do you still practice? Do you still sell? And if so, do you do designated dual agency? Because what you're really asking is there any point at which I'm going to be what? Working against you in a transaction? Because if that BIC is still selling, and that BIC practices designated dual agency in the firm, is there at least some chance that you could be designated against your broker in charge at some point? So you ought to ask how that would be handled. Everybody good? All right. So let's talk about here. Let's talk about disclosing agency. That's a good review of agency possibilities, agency choices, the 4 things that are available from the client's perspective. However, it's not important that just you understand those 4 choices. This is slide 46, by the way, from last week. So it should be on like page 23. Fancy math, right? 2 per page, 46. So, it's not just you that needs to know. Is it important that your client or your customer be able to tell you or somebody else who asks them, yeah, Brittany is this, when they walk away from that conversation? Or Jay represents the seller. Is that important for a buyer to know if they're talking to Jay? Absolutely. That's what we mean when we say disclosing agency. It's all about telling the consumer. Now I use that word consumer because a consumer could be either a what? Client or a customer. Consumer just means purchaser or seller. It means somebody who's in the market. They could be client or customer. It's all about telling that consumer who you are, who you represent, whether you represent them, whether you represent the other side, whether you don't represent anybody yet. Whatever your status is, you need to be disclosing it to that particular consumer at that moment so that they know your perspective. If you're the buyer and you're talking to an agent that represents the seller, you need to be aware of that. Absolutely. So you don't do what? So you don't say things that could be used against you in the transaction. Does that make sense for everybody? And we have to warn them. That's where this form called Working with Real Estate Agents comes from. And we're going to talk about this idea of first substantial contact. Now, I want to point out something to you here, and it's very rare that I can give you verbatim what a test question is going to say. But it's been on the exam every year since I got my license, and it'll probably be on the exam every year until you die, because everybody misses it, even though we tell you it's coming and it's going to be there. This is a sales transaction. Look, I got a new clicker. Look up right. Doesn't take much to excite me, right? This is a sales transaction form. Sales. 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 Is sales all? Are sales and all the same word? No. Does it say this is for all transactions? No. It says it's for what kind of transactions? Sales. Is a lease a sale transaction? Is a rental a sale transaction? Is property management a sale transaction? No. So on a test, if one of the answer choices says this should be given to consumers in all real estate transactions, is that a true or false statement? False. It's false. And I'm telling you, it's going to show up verbatim, word for word, just like that. I know it is. And 70% of you will get it wrong because you'll be in such a hurry that you don't pay attention. Here's one thing I'll tell you. You should automatically be skeptical of words like all.
Yes.
Always. All. How many things have we talked about thus far in this class that don't have some exception to the rule? Not many, if any, right? There are very few things that we talk about I mean, one of the biggest ones, one of the most ironclad rules. The Real Estate Commission cannot fine a licensee. That's one of the ironclad rules. Except, is there an exception? There's one exception to that, unless they're a what? Timeshare developer. So even that has got an exception to it. Almost everything we talk about in a real estate class has some sort of an exception. You should be very skeptical of words like all. When people start talking to you in absolutes, you should always look at them and go, you're a moron. Because there's nothing absolute in the world. We can fix this. But you can't. If you could, the humans that existed for 1,000,000 years before you would have already done it. We can try to fix it. Is that a different statement? And on a test, the word all, always, is probably, I'm not going to say it's definitely wrong, but I'm going to say it probably is. You should be very skeptical of that kind of language. Because all transactions would be wrong here for using this document. Is everybody with me on that? Good, good. So, this form, called the Working with Real Estate Agents Brochure, go ahead and take your book out. I know I don't say that very often, if ever. But turn to chapter 7. I'm going to borrow yours, Maggie, and give you a page number here real quickly on this thing. What page? 173. Have you memorized them all? 173 is the signature page, and if you want to turn back to page 168 and 169, you'll see the actual brochure itself. It looks like this. This morning I went around the office and I could only find the Spanish version, but it works just fine as a teaching prop. This form is the only one that actually comes from the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. When we talk about other forms in this class, the Real Estate Commission does not publish forms for you, like contracts and listing agreements and agency agreements and leases and all those amendments and addenda and all that stuff that we use to get a transaction done. The Real Estate Commission says you are on your own for that. Hire who? An attorney. Hire an attorney to draft all that mess for you. But they do give you this one. So what do you think that means? Is it important? It is important. This document should be given to every consumer, and notice I'm purposefully using the word consumer, not what? Not client, nor what? Customer, because consumer includes which one of those two groups? Both. This should be given to every consumer in what kind of a transaction? In a sales transaction, and it should be done no later than first substantial contact. We're going to talk about what that is. But before we even talk about what first substantial contact is, let's talk about the purpose of the thing. The purpose of the thing is to be a Miranda warning. How many of you know what the Miranda warning is? Reading someone their rights. We've seen it on 1,000 different television shows over the years. Give it to me. How does it start? You have the right to remain silent. Boy, that's a big statement, right? I find they have the right to, but they probably don't have the ability to. Those are two different things. You have the right to remain silent. And why is that important? What's the next thing say? Anything you say, what? Can and will be used against you in this real estate transaction. Isn't that how it goes? That's exactly how the Real Estate Commission wants you to think of this document. Now, you're not going to read that language, but that's how the Real Estate Commission wants you to present this document. Because when you're talking to a consumer, you do not yet represent them. Does that make sense? So whether you intend to represent them or whether you intend to work against them, should they be sharing a bunch of personal confidential information with you? No. Because even if you think they might hire you, they haven't yet done so. Does that make sense? And if they don't hire you and they've already told you a bunch of information, could you end up using it against them in a transaction? Yes. Yes, and that's why it's dangerous for them. So let's talk about when we have to do this thing. First thing I want to point out here, there is no such time, keep the books out because you'll need them. I see some people putting them away. I'm not done with it yet. We're going to look at the signature page in a minute. There's no such thing as too early to do this. The whole idea is to warn somebody so that they don't do what? They don't disclose information. They don't harm themselves. So when's the best time to do that? before they what? Before they start disclosing information. Does that make sense for everybody? That's not the rule though. The Real Estate Commission never gives you rules that say the best time to do this is here. What do you think their rules are? Like, they don't put signs up on the highway that say the best speed, the recommended speed is 60 miles an hour. They put up a sign that says the speed limit is 65. Isn't that the way laws and rules work? So when the Real Estate Commission puts out a rule, they're not saying to you that the best time to get to working with real estate agents is first substantial contact. They're telling you that that is the what? The last time. That's the last possible moment you can do it. And we call that first substantial contact. It can happen in person, it can happen on a computer, it can happen on the phone, it can happen in any number of ways. So let's talk about what first substantial contact is. And this needs to be in your notes. You need to be really clear on this. First substantial contact is not first face-to-face contact. It's not introducing myself. It's not saying, hey Tommy, I'm Travis, how are you doing? That is not first substantial contact. Let me see if I can demonstrate it. Hey Lee, how you doing? I'm good. It's nice to meet you. What brings you out to the open house today?
Just looking around, seeing what's on the market.
Just looking around, seeing what's on the market. Would you have a chance to look around?
Yes.
You did. What did you think of the house?
It's very nice.
It's very nice. Are you in the market currently?
Yes, I am.
Just looking to downsize, looking to upsize, moving to the area? What's going on?
Look at the downsize.
Looking to downsize. I need to let you know I represent the seller. She just gave me what? Personal, confidential information about herself. Because think of that innocent little statement. Looking to downsize. Where does she live? In a big house. Where? In this area. And I already know that about her based on that one statement, right? And not only do I know she lives in a big house in this area, I know she needs to do what? She needs to sell it. Is that information that would be useful to my client, the seller, in dealing with her in the transaction? Absolutely. That is first substantial contact. Notice I could carry on the conversation up to that point just as naturally as could be. But as soon as she gave me that first piece of personal confidential information about herself that could potentially be used in the transaction, what did I have to do? I had to double back and give her the warning. What did I say to her? Let me let you know I represent who? The seller. There's her warning. Yes, ma'am. Okay. They didn't do that. Did you slap them? You should have. No, don't do that. Don't do that. That's a violation of the agency law. The whole thing here is, I have to be careful the way I say this because I want it to be funny, but I don't want you to take it to the wrong extreme. It's your job to get all the information you possibly can that would help your client in the transaction, right? But the Real Estate Commission recognizes you have an unfair advantage because when Lee answered that question, did she realize she was giving away something that would hurt her in the transaction? No. So I'm supposed to be the grown-up in the conversation that stops and says, hey, let me remind you, I represent who? The seller. Hopefully, she would recognize something changed about the conversation at that point in time, and she would do what? Shut up. Now, if she continues to talk, are we going to use it against her? Yes. Just like the prosecutor would if you were arrested and you continued to talk after you were read your rights. We're going to continue to, it's not like we're going to put earplugs in and not listen anymore. Here's what I would say to Lee. Exactly how I've come to present it. And there's no script for this. You develop what you're comfortable with. The only scripted part is I represent the seller, because that you can't change. You can't sugarcoat that. Lee, let me remind you, I represent the seller. So please don't tell me anything you wouldn't want the seller to know. That's my take on the best way to give her that information, because it doesn't sound confrontational, to me at least. And it also conveys the message to her that she needs to be careful about what she says, right? I think I saw Shanna's first, and I'll come over here.
Yeah, I just have a quick question.
Yep.
So, if you're hosting an open house and someone walks in and, you know, and you, I guess you want to be proactive and say, hey, I just want to let you know that
I represent the seller.
Yeah, represent the seller before you even say anything that could potentially be used against you.
Yep.
So would you then at that point have them sign the brochure or the, okay.
Whenever you present the brochure, we haven't talked about the signature yet, but when you present the brochure to them, that's the time to have them sign the brochure.
So anytime someone walks into an open house, you should have brochures ready to hand out to them.
No question. Not only anytime somebody walks into an open house, in theory, if you have a real estate license, should you always have this available in some fashion?
Yeah.
Because you can have first substantial contact anywhere. You know, I've told this story 100 times in class. It's very true. I had first substantial contact in drive-thru at Burger King one time. This one right down here on Wake Forest Road. I was teaching class. We were on lunch. I went to go get something to eat. Pulled to the drive-thru. I pulled up to the window. The lady was super nice, and she was just chatty. And they were waiting for something. And she said, "Honey, how you doing today?" And I said, "I'm good. How are you?" And she said, "Oh, you know, just another day in paradise." And I laughed at her. And she said, "You on lunch break?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm on lunch teaching a class, trying to get back down there." "What kind of classes you teach?" And I said, "I teach real estate. I own a real estate school." And she goes, here's what she said. She said, "Ooh, I need to talk to you because my husband and I, we've been thinking about buying a house and my credit's real bad right now, but we've been working on that, trying to get that fixed and get that credit score up." Has she already told me personal confidential information? Right there in the drive-thru. We have first substantial contact. You see what I mean? And so in theory, we should always have it ready because you don't know when first substantial contact is going to happen. That's the idea behind it. Did I have her sign it? No. I'll be honest and say I did not. I said, "Well, I hope you do well with that. Good luck." And I got my Whopper and went on about my business. You know? Nobody's perfect. You know, hey, me and Mike's and I'll come right here. Go ahead.
So do people try to kind of twist it around a little bit by saying like, well, I'd like to let you know I do represent the seller, so I am qualified to answer any questions that you may have about this property, to make it sound like a beneficial thing.
Sure, absolutely. And one of the things is, what I find is just being honest with them is probably one of the greatest things you can do to get them to open up and be willing to work with you. Because sometimes if you just say to them, "Hey, let me remind you I represent the seller, don't tell me anything you wouldn't want the seller to know," people will go, "Oh." Because immediately you start drawing comparisons to other real estate brokers they've encountered that didn't do that, right? And they start thinking, "Oh, well, this person's pretty honest. They did straightforward." And you know, you can always make it a positive.
Well, what I'm saying is,
He's trying to get information.
like sneak it in there, say what you have to say, but make it seem like not necessarily a threat.
What I'm
saying
saying,
something
what I'm saying is, you have to make it clear to them that anything they say about themselves is fair game in some way. So whatever way that works for you, you got to read them their rights and let them know that anything they say is fair game. Yes, ma'am.
And just to flip this to a buyer side, because you do represent buyers as well. You know, you tell your buyers, hey, and they might say, "I'm going to love to some open houses." Wouldn't you also let them know, hey, when you walk in the door,
Remember, you're not talking to me
you're
anymore.
not talking to me anymore, so make sure, you know, let them know you're working with an agent.
Yep. One of the first things I do when I'm working with a buyer client, Lee's question is a great one. How do I handle the fact your buyers are going to, for lack of a better way to describe it, they're going to step out on you. They're going to, right? They're going to go to open houses when you're not there with them. They are certainly going to go to on-site new home construction model homes and look around when you're not there with them. You still represent them. And here's what I would tell you does not work. Don't you dare go to those places without me. Because you tell them that, first thing to do is run right out and go. Just give them a stack of your business cards. Give them 10 or 12 of your business cards and say, "Here, when you go out and you want to look at an open house or you want to go to an on-site new construction place, this is your get-out-of-jail-free card." Because that person that comes and swarms on you and wants to sell you something, just hand them my card and say, "I have an agent," and they will leave you completely alone. And so that way, they view it as a positive thing to protect that agency relationship because they want to get that person out of their face, right? And so just give them your cards and have them just give it to the agent. You know, I have an agent, you can call him or you can email him. And the other broker will appreciate it too, because they'll reach out and they say, "Hey, your clients came to my open house, and is there anything I can help you with?" And it's great for me because it gives me feedback on where they've been. So now I know, because the other broker reaches out to me and says, your buyers are in here, and I have an idea, because they don't often tell you, you know. And even if they didn't like it, it's a good thing to know what they're looking at, because it may help you with their search moving forward, right? If you know, you end up looking like a much smarter person, because if you say, oh, well, let's go out to Timber Creek and check out those new townhomes they got out there. If they've already been and looked at them 3 times and they thought they sucked, you look like a fool for suggesting it, right? If you gave them your card and they handed it to them when they went out there, you already know they've been out there, so that you can say, well, I know you checked out Timber Creek. What did you think of those? And so it's very helpful to do things like that.
I'm sure that experience, I have that experience, and it really works.
Mm-hmm.
So when you get it to an open house, they come to you and.
Of course they do.
And then you say, excuse me, I already have an agent, and they just go, shh.
Right.
You know, it works so good.
It works great. It works great. I'll give you another one to give you an analogy. Did any of you shop at Sam's Club? I have to go to Sam's Club all the time because of the coffee and cups and all that stuff out here. If you have a membership at Sam's Club, the one thing I hate the most about Sam's Club, well, other than the fact that it's Sam's Club, but the one thing I hate the most is the DirecTV people at the front. Like every Sam's Club on earth has them. And they're the most aggressive people, like they just tackle you as soon as you walk in the front. I walk in the front door now going, I have DirecTV. You know what? They leave you alone because they can't make any money off of you. And it's the same idea. By handing them that card, they know that there's nothing to be gained from the conversation, so they move along and they leave your client alone. Okay? We all feel like we're okay about that? Do we understand this idea of first substantial contact? Remember, there's no such thing as too early. Could you do it as soon as you met somebody? Sure you could. The idea here is you can't do it any later than first substantial contact. So if you happen to be mid-sentence, mid-paragraph, and they give you this information, you're expected to stop. Yes, sir.
From the last time I bought a house, we saw it online, made an appointment with the seller's agent, so we went out there, walked through the house, never talked about this. As soon as we kind of walked back through, we said, we really like this, and we started really engaging with that realtor, and, you know, we want to seriously buy it. Then he actually did it.
Good. Good. So it sounds like you did it exactly right.
I think he did a pretty good job.
That's good. That's what we like to hear. Yes, Jocelyn.
Should you have those brochures pre-filled out with your license and your name and everything?
I mean, it depends on how nervous of a person you are. It takes me 3 seconds to write my license number on there, you know, and so I'm not really concerned about that. But yeah, if it makes you feel better to have them pre-filled out, sure, absolutely. As long as your name and license number is on there. Keep in mind, the portion of the document that they sign, which we're about to talk about, the signature panel, you keep. So you can go back and write your name and license number on there when you get home that night. Is everybody good on that? And I will tell you, one of the things that real estate brokers struggle with about this thing is, how do I file? Because in theory, are you going to have many more of these on file than you have transactions?
Yes.
Yeah, because not every person you have first substantial contact with is going to turn into a transaction. In fact, I found over my career I probably have 10 or 12 times more of these than I actually have transaction files. I've had agents all over the years go, it's so stupid to have to start a transaction file and keep it just for this working real estate. I got so many folders that that's the only thing in there. I said, okay, it's stupid. I'm not going to agree with you there, because what I'm going to say to you is you're the one saying you have to do that. The Real Estate Commission never said you did. The Real Estate Commission simply says you have to keep them. You know what my filing system is for these things? A shoebox. I have a shoebox in my office. It's right beside my desk. When I come back in the office, if I've had somebody sign one of these things, I throw it in the shoebox. That's it. And I've had people say, well, then don't you have to go dig it back out and put, if they actually do a transaction with you, you got to have one signed in the transaction file, which is true, right? How many of you have ever made an offer on a house? Is it a bunch of pieces of paper to sign? Like 30 pieces of paper by the time you talk about buyer agency agreements and contracts and all that sort of thing? Would you notice somebody put this in there for the second time for them to sign? And so I don't even bother more than trying to find the one that's in the box. If they do another transaction, so I have it in the transaction file, I just have them sign it again when we're writing the offer. And that way it's right there with the offer. I put it all in the file together. Does that make sense? Because if the Real Estate Commission ever came in and said, are you presenting the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure? You know what I would do? Give them the box. There you go. That's the best proof in the world that I'm doing it. And they would say, well, where are your transaction files? I'd be like, over there. And I said, well, how do you sort them out? I said, I don't. If they're in the transaction file, they're also in here, but also in here are the ones who never turned into transactions. They would look at me and they would go, have a wonderful day. That's all they don't require you to have some extensive file system, they just require you to keep them. Everybody all right with that? Okay? Yes?
Does it matter what the date is on there? Because there's a date portion on there. So when you have them sign it in, do they just, I guess, put the date on there from when you actually?
That date. That date.
That date.
That date. Because if there was ever any question, again, of when was first substantial contact, could I go back in the box and find the original one? Sure, absolutely.
So just have a shoebox for every fiscal year.
That's what I do. At the end of every year, I just put the top of my box and start a new box. There you go. That's it. Yes, ma'am.
Could you scan them?
Yes, absolutely. I could. I will tell you, I'm lazy about scanning these because if you look at the brochure, turn in the book, it's 3 pages, 173. Is that what you said, Jocelyn? You turn to page 173, you see a blown up picture of the signature panel. Here's why I don't like scanning these, because if I use the actual brochure version, the signature panel is this little tear-off piece right here. And I'm lazy, I don't like to open the top of the copier. I don't like to scan things that are on full pieces of paper, right? So usually when I have them sign it for what's going in my transaction file, which is actually going to be scanned, I print it on full-size paper so I can just stack it all together and feed it through the copier. But yes, absolutely, the digital record would work.
Or just take a picture of it?
Take a picture of it. Take a picture of it and throw it away. As long as you have... What the Real Estate Commission's rule says about record keeping is you have to have the ability to produce a paper copy. It doesn't say you have to maintain a paper copy. You just have to have the ability. And for most of us, that means I don't keep paper. In fact, most of my transactions never actually have any paper. Most of my transactions are all digital. I mean, the documents are created digitally. I send them out for electronic signatures. They come back signed electronically. I never even have a hard paper copy of that, and that's perfectly fine. That's perfectly fine. Is that everybody? Okay? We all good on this idea of first substantial contact. So, things you need to know about the signature panel, which is in your book on page 173. At the very top, it says, this is not a contract. Now, they put that there for your benefit, because people are going to be very reluctant to do what? To sign this thing. Think about yourself. If you're talking to a person that you just met at an open house and they just said, by the way, I need to tell you I represent the seller, here, sign this, what would you say? No. Which brings me to the most important point of the whole thing. It doesn't matter if they sign it. I know some of you are OCD and you're going to have to get over it. It doesn't matter if they sign it. If they do, great. If they don't, equally great. You simply don't care. Your job is to present it whether they sign it or not. Can you work with them if they don't sign it? Yes, absolutely. No rule that says you cannot work with a client who does not sign the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure. They're simply not required to. Does that make sense for everybody? Yes, sir.
Should you make a note that they declined?
Yes, absolutely. You want to make a note that they would not sign it, because then that notates that you did what? That you presented it, which is what you want proof of anyway. And I will tell you, this is where I'm sneaky. My patented maneuver is this. When somebody declines to sign it, I take it back and I say, no problem. I don't blame you. I don't sign stuff I don't know what it is either. And so I'll take it right here and I'll write on the top, would not sign. And I underline the word not like that. Just like that. And I'll say, Chad, would you mind signing right here, just saying that you wouldn't sign it? Every time. Every time. Because again, what I've done is taken the pressure away from the thing. They feel really clear at that point they're not committing to something. Does that make sense? You know? And so, even if he won't, I don't worry about it. Because now I've got proof that I presented it. So, if he would not sign it, I'm just going to write in his name, whatever I know. People say, well, I don't know his last name. Chad. That's who he is. He's Chad. You had first substantial contact with buyer Chad. And you put the date, and you put your firm's name, and your license number. And you're done with it. Does that make sense for everybody? That's it. That's all there is to the thing. There's nothing super complex about the signature part of it. Try to get it. If you can, great. You know, what I'll tell you is this. the more you insist on getting it signed, the more resistant they are to signing it. The more you don't care about it, the more likely they are just to sign the thing. So it's just going to be a comfort level for you in getting people to sign it. Look down at the bottom in your book, at the very bottom of the signature panel. On that signature panel, you've got a separate acknowledgement down there at the bottom where it says disclosure of what? Seller subagency. What do we say that means? Don't get complex on the terminology. What it means? I am a what?
Agent.
I'm an agent. I'm affiliated with what firm?
Seller.
The firm representing the what? Seller. Who would I be talking to that it would be necessary to give this little warning to? A buyer. So if I'm presenting this thing to a buyer, but I represent who? The seller, then I'm going to give them this little bottom section down here. And notice what it says. It's just like a warning. What does it say? When helping you or assisting you with the purchase of a property, the above agent and firm will represent who? The seller. It's just a little secondary acknowledgement. And again, what if they won't initial it? We don't care. We're not initial. That's exactly right. Would you initial here saying that you refuse to initial? That's all there is. Okay? That is the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure. Remember, it is used in what kind of transactions? Sales transactions. Not all transactions. So, a farm sale, would you use it? Yes. A lease of timber property, would you use it? No. Okay? Good. Good. All right, that's probably a pretty good stopping point for a first break. So why don't we stop right there, pause right there, and then we'll come back and we're going to talk about the remainder of our duties to our clients, skill, care, and diligence, and disclosure of information. Okay?